My husband aggressively handed me a train ticket on our honeymoon departure day, announcing the company gave me just 2 business class tickets. So I'm taking my mom on the flight, you'll have to go by train. He then abruptly took my luggage and left. Now he's frantically calling me in panic, shocked from the airport because, "Hi, I'm Maud. I've always been good at understanding people, which is probably why I became a psychologist. I had my own practice and spent most of my time helping others with their problems. It's funny when I think about what happened to me later. As I was nearing my late 40s, something unexpected happened. I realized I wanted to start a family. It's strange how those feelings sneak up on you. My best friend, Sydney, must have noticed how I was feeling. One day, while we were having coffee, she suggested setting me up with her second cousin. "Come on, Maud," she said. "He's a great guy, smart, funny, and has a good job. What do you have to lose?" I stirred my latte, feeling unsure. "I don't know, Sydney. Blind dates aren't really my thing." She rolled her eyes. "It's not a blind date if I show you his picture first. Plus, you can talk online before meeting in person. It's the perfect setup." That's how I ended up sending Mark a friend request on social media. To my surprise, we clicked right away. Mark was 41, just a year older than me, and he seemed truly interested in what I had to say. Our conversations were easy and natural without any awkward moments. We chatted for weeks before finally deciding to meet in person. When the day came, I was so nervous. My palms were sweating as I waited for him at the coffee shop we had chosen. When Mark walked in, I felt my breath catch. He was tall, with kind eyes and a warm smile. He saw me right away and waved as he came over. "Maud?" he asked, holding out his hand. I smiled and nodded. "That's me. It's nice to finally meet you in person, Mark." He sat down across from me, and just like that, my nerves disappeared. We talked for hours, completely losing track of time. The barista eventually reminded us that the shop was closing. As we stepped outside into the cool evening, Mark turned to me. "I had a great time, Maud. Would you like to do this again sometime?" he asked, and that's how it all began. I didn't even have to think about it. "I'd love to," I said. From that moment, I fell completely in love with Mark. We started spending more and more time together, going out for dinner, taking walks in the park, and even enjoying a few weekend trips. Things felt perfect. But as our relationship grew, I started noticing something odd. Mark's phone was always buzzing with messages. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone has a busy life, right? But with Mark, it felt constant. One night, after a nice dinner, we were lying in bed, and his phone lit up again for what felt like the 100th time that day. I couldn't help myself. "Busy night?" asked, trying to sound casual. Mark glanced at his phone and gave a shy smile. "Oh, it's just my mom. She likes to check in." I raised an eyebrow. "Your mom? This late?" He shrugged, looking a little uncomfortable. "Yeah, we're really close. She raised me on her own after my dad died when I was 6. I had bad asthma as a kid, and she saved my life more than once." As Mark shared stories about his childhood, it became clear that his mom wasn't just devoted, she was his whole world. "Sounds like you two have a special bond," I said carefully. Mark nodded enthusiastically. "We do. I owe her everything." As a psychologist, I couldn't help but feel a small warning in the back of my mind. Their relationship seemed unusually close, maybe even too dependent, but I pushed those thoughts aside. I wasn't his therapist, I was his girlfriend. It wasn't my place to overthink it. Weeks turned into months, and soon we had been dating for almost a year. Mark was sweet and attentive, and our relationship felt strong. But I couldn't fully shake that uneasy feeling about his connection with his mom. One day, while we were having lunch at my place, Mark suddenly looked nervous. He started playing with his napkin. "Maud," he said, hesitating, "I'd like you to meet my mom." "I think you'll really like her," Mark said. "She's excited to meet you too." The next weekend, I found myself standing outside a big 3-story house, my palms sweaty. Mark squeezed my hand to calm me as he rang the doorbell. When the door opened, a petite woman with gray hair and kind eyes greeted us with a warm smile. "You must be Maud," she said, pulling me into an unexpected hug. "I'm Mary. Come on in." As we sat in the living room, I noticed that Mary's eyes were almost always on Mark. She fussed over him constantly, asking if he wanted a drink or a snack while barely acknowledging me. I sat there feeling like an outsider as Mary dominated the conversation, sharing stories about Mark's childhood and asking endless questions about his health. By the time we left, I felt drained, but Mark seemed completely at ease. "So, what did you think?" he asked eagerly as we drove away. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Your mom really loves you, Mark." He grinned. "She's great, isn't she? I knew you'd like her." I forced a smile, not wanting to ruin his mood. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that their relationship wasn't as simple as it seemed. 6 months flew by, And before I knew it, Mark was down on one knee with a sparkling ring. Despite my worries about his relationship with Mary, I said yes. I loved him, and I believed we could figure things out together. We decided to move in together at my apartment, and soon after, we started planning the wedding. I had imagined it would be an exciting and fun experience, but I quickly realized it wasn't going to be that simple. Mary was involved in every single decision, no matter how small. It wasn't just the wedding either. Mary called Mark all the time, always with some emergency that needed his immediate attention. One evening, as we were talking about flower arrangements, Mark's phone rang. He answered right away, his face full of concern. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked. After a pause, he said, "The sink's leaking? I'll be right there." He hung up and looked at me apologetically. "I have to go help her. You know how she is with plumbers." This became a regular thing. If it wasn't a leaking sink, it was a stubbed toe, a bad mood, or something else only Mark could fix. And if he hesitated, Mary would guilt-trip him with, "After all I've done for you, I just need a little help. Is that too much to ask?" Mary's constant needs were wearing me down, and I couldn't stay quiet anymore. One night, after Mark came home from another one of her emergencies, I decided to talk to him. "Mark," I said gently, "I think we should see a couples therapist. Maybe they can help us figure out how to handle things with your mom. I feel like her demands are too much sometimes." Mark's voice rose immediately. "Too much? She raised me on her own, Maud. She saved my life more than once. How can you call that too much?" I took a deep breath and tried to calm him. "I'm not saying she doesn't love you or that you shouldn't care about her. I'm just worried about how it's affecting us." Mark's expression softened a little. "Okay, maybe you're right. But can we wait until after the wedding? We're so busy right now, and I don't want to add more stress." I knew I should have insisted on dealing with it before we got married, but I was exhausted from this ongoing struggle with Mary. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The next few weeks were a blur of wedding planning, cake tastings, dress fittings, and endless phone calls with Mary. Before I knew it, the wedding was just a few days away. Despite all the stress, I was excited. My friends had planned a bachelorette party, and I couldn't wait for a fun night without any talk about the wedding or Mary. We went to our favorite bar, and for the first time in months, I felt free. We laughed, danced, and had a great time. It was such a relief to finally relax without worrying about Mary or the wedding. But then my phone rang. I saw Mark's name on the screen, and his voice was tight with panic. "Maud, Mom's in the hospital. Her blood pressure spiked. I'm heading there now." My heart sank. I quickly explained to my friends what was happening and called a taxi. The ride to the hospital felt endless as my mind raced through every worst-case scenario. When I finally got to the hospital, Mary saw me and immediately let out a dramatic moan. "Oh, it's you," she said, covering her face with her hands. "My blood pressure, it's her fault. All this sweating stress." I froze, completely shocked. "Mary, I started to say, but she peeked through her fingers and glared at me. "I can't handle this right now." My poor heart. Mark looked at me with an apologetic but serious expression. "Maud, could you wait outside for a bit?" he asked gently. Stunned, I nodded and walked out, sinking into a chair in the hallway. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching nurses and doctors rush by. Finally, I decided I needed answers and walked over to the nurses' station. Trying to keep my tone professional, I said to the doctor nearby, "Excuse me, I'm Maud, Mary Johnson's future daughter-in-law. Can you tell me about her condition?" The doctor looked up, calm and composed. "Mrs. Johnson's blood pressure is high, but it's not dangerously so. We're keeping an eye on her, but there's no immediate reason to worry." I let out a breath of relief and thought about my next words. "Doctor, I'm a psychologist, and I'm concerned that Mrs. Johnson might have some mental health issues. Has anyone looked into that?" The doctor raised an eyebrow, looking a bit surprised. "That's an interesting observation. We haven't done a mental health evaluation, but based on what you've said, it might be worth considering. I'll make a note to refer her for an assessment." I nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Thank you, doctor. I appreciate your help." I went back to my seat in the hallway and waited, hoping Mark would come out soon. But as more time passed, it became clear he wasn't coming out anytime soon. Feeling defeated, I sent him a text, "Heading home. Call me when you can." I called a taxi and returned to our apartment. My phone buzzed with messages from my friends asking what had happened. I quickly replied, apologizing and telling them to enjoy the rest of the night without me. It was well past midnight when I heard the key turn in the door. Mark walked in, looking completely exhausted. "Hey," he said softly, "you're still up." I sat up, trying to hide my frustration. "How's your mom?" I asked. Mark sighed and sank into the armchair across from me. "She's okay. They're keeping her overnight for observation. I stayed with her until she finally fell asleep." "She was so upset, Maud. She kept begging me not to leave her alone. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Mark, do you really think that's all there is to this? Don't you see what's happening?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Maud, please not tonight. Can we just go to bed? I'm really tired." I wanted to argue, to make him understand, but seeing how worn out he was, I knew it wasn't the right time. I nodded, swallowing my frustration. The big day finally arrived. Just before the ceremony, Mark pulled me aside, taking a deep breath. "Look, I know things have been tough with Mom lately, but I've made some arrangements to keep her happy today. I just need you to go along with it, please." My heart sank. "What kind of arrangements?" Mark quickly explained. Mary had a special menu prepared because she claimed to have allergies, which I knew weren't real. She would sit next to him at the head table, not with the other parents. The DJ had a list of her favorite songs to play. Then Mark hesitated before adding, "She also wants to make a speech." I closed my eyes, counting to 10 in my head before finally saying, "Okay, for you." "For us." Mark kissed me, clearly relieved. I forced a smile and returned to my bridesmaids, pushing my feelings aside. The ceremony itself was beautiful. As I walked down the aisle and saw Mark's face light up, a wave of love washed over me, pushing aside all my doubts. For that moment, it felt like it was just the two of us. The reception, though, was exactly what Mark had warned me about. Mary was front and center at our table, constantly telling stories about Mark's childhood. She barely acknowledged I was there, except to occasionally pat my hand in a patronizing way. When it was time for the speeches, I braced myself. I watched in disbelief as Mary stumbled up to the microphone, holding a glass of wine. "My dear friends and family," she began, her voice shaky, "we're here to celebrate my only son's wedding day." She went on and on, talking about Mark's childhood, his achievements, and all the sacrifices she had made for him. I was mentioned only once, and even then it was a quick afterthought. Finally, as she finished her speech, Mary raised her glass. "To my son and his wife, may they be as happy as Mark and I have always been." I drained my champagne in one gulp. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We danced, laughed, and cut the cake. But Mary was always there, hovering, inserting herself into every moment. The wedding was over, but nothing changed. In the months that followed, Mary called every day, sometimes more than once. There was always a new crisis or reason she needed Mark's attention immediately. One day, as Mark grabbed his keys to rush out the door, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Mark, we need to talk about this," I said firmly. "It's not healthy for any of us." He sighed, running his hand through his hair. I know. You're right. We should see someone, a therapist, like you suggested. Let's look into it this weekend." But when the weekend came, there was always an excuse. Mary needed help with her groceries, the lawn had to be mowed, or her cat needed to go to the vet. Week after week, it was the same thing. Empty promises and endless delays. Months into our marriage, I was at my breaking point. Mary's constant interruptions, Mark's inability to set boundaries, and the strain on our relationship were wearing me down. When my vacation time came up, I saw it as a chance to escape. One evening, I brought it up carefully. "Mark, why don't we go on a honeymoon? Just the two of us, away from everything. What do you think?" To my surprise, Mark's face lit up. "That sounds amazing, Maud. Where do you want to go?" We spent the next hour excitedly planning a tropical getaway. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. This could be our chance to reconnect, to remember why we fell in love. "I'll handle everything," Mark promised. "The flights, the hotel, everything. And when we get back, we'll deal with the situation with Mom. Maybe even look into therapy." The day of our trip finally arrived, and I was full of excitement as we drove to the airport. Mark seemed a little distracted, but I figured it was just pre-flight nerves. When we got to the check-in counter, Mark handed me my boarding pass. I glanced at the boarding pass and froze. "Economies?" I asked, confused. "I thought we were flying together." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, about that. I used some credit card points, but it was only enough for one first-class ticket. Since I'm taller, it made sense for me to take it. Plus, it saves us money." I stared at him, hurt and confused. "But it's our honeymoon. Couldn't we both just fly economy and sit together?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. "Come on, Maud," he said, sounding slightly irritated. "Don't make a big deal out of this. It's just a few hours." Swallowing my disappointment, I tried again. "Okay, well, can I at least come to the first-class lounge with you? Maybe we could pay extra." "No." Mark cut me off quickly. "The ticket's in my name, and they won't let you in. Look, I've got to go check in. I'll see you on the other side, okay?" Before I could respond, he was already walking away, wheeling his suitcase toward the first-class check-in. I stood there, feeling deflated, then made my way through security and into the regular boarding lounge. As I sat there, Trying to hold on to some excitement for the trip, I caught a glimpse of something outside the first-class lounge, a familiar figure with gray hair and a floral dress. My heart raced. It looked just like something Mary would wear. I shook my head. Am I imagining things? I wondered. But then I thought about Mark's strange behavior, his insistence on flying first class alone, his refusal to let me into the lounge. It all started to make a terrible kind of sense. Without thinking twice, I stood up and walked to the first-class lounge desk. "Excuse me," I said, pulling out my credit card. "I'd like to buy access to the lounge, please." The attendant gave me a skeptical look but processed my payment. As she handed me the access card, I took a deep breath, bracing myself for what I might find. I pushed open the door to the lounge and scanned a room filled with plush seats and buffet tables, and there, in a quiet corner by the window, sat Mark and Mary. They were sitting close together, talking over cups of coffee. They looked comfortable, like they were about to head off on their own little adventure. My heart sank, but I forced myself to walk toward them, my heels clicking loudly on the polished floor. They both looked up as I approached. I walked up to them, and I saw the color drain from Mark's face. "Maud," he exclaimed, quickly standing up. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my voice cold. "Care to explain why you're here with your mother instead of your wife?" Mark glanced nervously around the lounge. "Maud, please," he said in a low voice. "Let's not do this here. I can explain everything after we land, I promise." Before I could respond, Mary chimed in, her voice overly sweet. "Oh, Maud, dear. What a surprise. Mark and I are just about to enjoy a lovely first-class trip together. Isn't that nice? But what are you doing in this lounge?" Mark stuck between us, his face full of guilt and panic. "Maud, I'm sorry. The truth is there were enough points for 3 first-class tickets. I thought Mom deserved a nice trip." "And what about me, Mark?" I asked, my voice rising. "I'm your wife. We're supposed to be starting our life together, but instead, you're flying off with your mother while I'm stuck in economy, like an afterthought." The lounge went completely silent. Everyone was staring at us, but I didn't care anymore. "Do you have any idea what it's been like these past few months?" I continued, years of frustration spilling out. "The constant calls, the emergencies, the way you always put her first. And now this. How could you do this to me?" Mark reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "Maud, please," he begged. "You need to calm down. We can talk once we're on vacation. We'll have time to figure things out, to get closer. We can fix this, I promise." I stared at him, suddenly feeling very calm but incredibly tired. "Fix this?" I said quietly. "Mark, there's nothing left to fix. I'm going home, and I'm filing for divorce." Mark's jaw dropped. "Divorce? Maud, you can't be serious." Before he could say more, Mary interjected, linking her arm through his. "Well, if that's how you feel, dear, I think it's for the best. Come along, Mark. We don't want to miss our flight." I stood there, stunned, as Mary led Mark away. He glanced back at me once, his face full of regret and maybe relief, before they disappeared through the boarding gate. For a moment, I just stood there, feeling the weight of all the curious stares. Then, without a word, I turned and walked out of the lounge, finally letting go. I walked through the airport, feeling strangely calm. My mind was blank, and I wasn't crying or screaming. Instead, all I felt was an overwhelming sense of freedom. When I got home, I spent the next few hours packing up Mark's things, his clothes, books, and the silly knickknacks his mother had given him. I did it all with a clear and steady mind. Once I was done, I called a courier to take everything to a nearby storage unit. The next day, I contacted a divorce lawyer. As I signed the paperwork, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't feel sad. I felt like I had made the right choice. I decided to use my vacation for myself. I redecorated the apartment, removing all traces of Mark. I reconnected with old friends, joined a yoga class, and finally read the books I'd been putting off for years. A month later, my phone buzzed with a message from Mark. I stared at it for a while before opening it. "Maud, please, can we talk?" I typed a short response. "Storage unit 250. Access code 9982. Your things are there. Divorce papers have been sent to your mom's house. Please sign and return them." Then, I blocked his number. Returning to work was refreshing. I threw myself into my practice with a new energy. The pain I had gone through gave me a deeper understanding of codependent relationships, and I realized I was stronger because of it. I used my experience to write a series of research papers, making sure to keep the details anonymous. To my surprise, those papers caught the attention of the psychology department at the local college. They invited me to give a guest lecture, which soon turned into a part-time teaching position. It was at the college where I met Jeremy, another professor in the psychology department. He was tall, with kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. We connected over our shared research interests and a mutual love for terrible puns. As the weeks passed, Jeremy and I grew closer. He was everything Mark wasn't: independent, respectful of boundaries, and confident. He had a teenage daughter from a previous marriage, and watching him balance being a father, his career, and our growing relationship was eye-opening. One evening, while we were grading papers together, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sydney, the friend who had introduced me to Mark. "Hey, Maud, just thought you should know. Mark is still living with Mary. If anything, they seem even closer now." I stared at the message for a moment, then smiled and put my phone down. It no longer mattered. My life was my own again, and I was happier than I'd been in years. "I'm so sorry for my part in all this. Hope you're doing okay," the message read. I stared at it for a moment, then set my phone aside. Jeremy noticed and asked gently, "Is everything all right?" I smiled, realizing that for the first time in a long time, everything truly was. "Yeah," I said. "Everything's fine." And it was. Mark and Mary's relationship was no longer my problem. I had my own life to live and my own path to follow.